comme nos
I'm going to resume with my introduction. It's really great that so many of you are here. Walter Mignolo is an absolutely central figure in the body of thought and practice that's come to be called decolonial theory. His books include The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Local Histories, Global Designs, The Idea of Latin America, and the recent The Darker Side of Western Modernity. He's currently a fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, and he's taken time out to come and be with us today. So, Walter, thank you, welcome, and we look forward to conversing with you.
For coming. Part of my job is to talk. I mean, not to talk, it's not giving talk, to chat with people. That's the way I am learning now. People are interested and what their interests are in general, but how they relate to the question of coloniality, and that's kind of helped me a lot to shape my arguments when I write or when I teach or when I talk. Because, you know, I mean, we always need data, but more important now, we need kind of theories, what we call, that help us to make sense of the highway of information. That there's too much data, too much information. So thank you for coming. We are not going to go around introducing yourself because there are too many. But when you intervene and ask questions or say something, just introduce yourself. I mean, your discipline and your name and your. So, I think that we will make a pause at 2 for people who have to leave.
Yeah.
So, and then we can stay and talk until there are energy and interest. So the question that I was asked to address is decoloniality, on decoloniality. What is this? So decoloniality now is used in many ways. If you go Google, put decoloniality or even coloniality, you find different uses. I would just refer to one meaning of coloniality and decoloniality, and I won't claim that this is the right one. I will claim that I have the right to talk about this sense of coloniality. When I said I said also we. I mean, the kind of collective that was formed in '98. The story is in the web too. So we are a collective of about 14, 15 core, and then there are new generation that kind of, and different parts of the world from Russia to Romania to, but this was born in South America. That is important, what we call the point of origination. Not the origin, but origination, in the sense that there is something going on when the concept of coloniality came. And I would say, and that came in the South, in the Andes, and there is a reason for that. The kind of the local histories that brought the concept of coloniality into being, in the same way that there is a local history, a local reason why the concept of biopolitics and biopowers emerged in Europe. So by saying that, I am kind of putting up front the geopolitics of knowing, sensing, and believing. We don't believe anymore that we have to go to Europe to think. And I will start by reading a paragraph of Jabulo Ndebele. Pronounced well. This is an article in his book 1887. I read that because if you change South Africa for South America, the rest is valid, right? He said, certainly the cultural reproduction of Europe in South Africa let's read South America, has been particularly beneficial for the settlers during the period of rampant capital accumulation. Unfortunately, periods of capital accumulation have been characterized by a general lack of scruple over the method of accumulation. By the time the period of accumulation reached the highest point of fruition for the settlers, well, in South America we don't have settler colonialists, we have state colonialists, but let's forget that. The kind of coloniality in the last analysis doesn't make difference between the settler and state colonialists. So it's highly reaches, when accumulation reaches its highest point of fruition for the settler, now habituated to the material advantages of imported metropolitan technology, and critical emulation had become an entrenched behavioral trait. It is eminently understandable why, now wielding considerable political and economic power, the white settlers of South Africa have insisted on being the human point of reference for all the people in this country. If we put South America, the rest is valid. It is for these reasons that many of them, I am a white Latin American, so a kind of dissenting of the kind of the elite that control the country. It is for this reason that many of them who want change, even those who hate apartheid with all their hearts, insist that the need for the maintenance of European culture in South Africa is not negotiable. Instead, change means drawing the opposite into the cultural and making its benefits available to all, to some extent, etc., etc. So that is, so you can relate the context in which in Latin America the concept of coloniality works. Because the progressive Marxists, the progressive postmodernists, who were for the indigenous people and still for indigenous people, needed to bring the indigenous people into the European. So Eurocentrism is not just the right. Eurocentrism is the good, the bad, and the ugly. So don't think when we talk about Eurocentrism that we just talk about the bad guys. No, Eurocentric is Marxism and Eurocentric is postmodernity. And I think what Jabulo is saying here is very kind of truth to Latin America today, and that is why the project of coloniality is not being seen with good eyes by Marxists and postmodernists in Latin America. The state of Bolivia, for example, don't like us. I mean, we have a really bad press in Bolivia because the state went to decolonize, and the state, not Evo Morales, but Lineras, is Marxist. So that is the context in which in the 90s the concept of coloniality emerged in that kind of tension between the moment in which Marxists and postmodernists were kind of trying to take over, but Quijano said, well, no, that doesn't work. So we need a different kind of concept, and so he introduced the concept of coloniality. And what is, I will go quickly on this point, what is coloniality? And what is the difference with colonialism? Colonialism is a historical or art historical and temporal way of domination. Like Spanish colonialism or Spanish imperial colonialism, French colonialism, British colonialism, Dutch colonialism, US colonialism even. So the first thing is coloniality doesn't need colonialism. I mean, it takes the name from colonialism, but since the 19th century, all over the world, we see coloniality without colonialism. And you probably see it in South Africa after apartheid too. What I mean, in South America was a lot of independence in the 19th century. Independence meant that at that moment the off-white Latin American kicked the Spanish and the Portuguese home. So there was no longer a colony, there were independent nation-state formation, or republics, as they call it. But what they did, they sent the Portuguese and the Spanish home. They were the tradition, and they fall in the hands of France and England. England controlled the economy, railroad, grain, meat, and France controlled the intellect. Right? No colonies, coloniality. So we call that internal colonialism. Internal colonialism, why? Because the natives, and the natives here were the whites, took over, and they did exactly the same that the bad guys were doing, but they were natives. And that is what happened in Africa, I mean in all Africa, in the process of decolonization during the Cold War, right? The natives took over, and look at the result in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, etc., etc. So the point is, coloniality is an underlying logic that's common to all modern imperial colonialism. What I mean modern is since 1500. Rome was imperial, but that's another story. Why is another story? Because Rome was not capitalist. And when we talk about modernity, coloniality, since 1500, we are saying that the new type of domination emerged, we call coloniality of power. And that coloniality of power goes hand in hand with the emergence of a new type of economy that Marxists and liberals call capitalism. So for us, it's not that America was discovered and integrated into an existing capitalist economy. Capitalism could not have existed as we know it today without the Americans. Why? For a good number of reasons. I give you two, the most obvious. Massive accumulation of land, expropriation and appropriation of land. Never in the history of human race, I would say, human being, was such a massive appropriation of land. Right? When you have land, and by land here I don't mean just land that we kind of generate crops like cotton and sugar that was in the Caribbean, but also extractivism, gold and silver. So when you have all that, what do you need? Labor. So massive exploitation of labor. The indigenous first, and when the kind of genocide is, the many go away, there was not enough labor. Well, bring Africans. So the African enslaved African began to be forced into the Americas. So when you have massive amount of land, massive exploitation of labor, you produce a lot, right? You produce a lot. And what do you do with that? You sell it to the emerging global market. So the change in the economy is that up to that point, all the existing economies before 1500, in the Kingdom of Africa, in Persia, in China, in India, the surplus was stored for exchange, all for need in time of draw or something like that. In 1600, the surplus began to be reinvested to produce more. Reinvested to produce more. Reinvested to produce more. And that is not primitive accumulation for us, that is bel et bien capitalism. Mercantile system, mercantile capitalism, we can distinguish The mercantile capitalism, yes, is a condition for kind of industrial capitalism, but it's in itself already the historical foundation of the kind of economic coloniality or capitalism. So, and one of the major consequences of that was the dispensability of human life. So, slavery existed. It was not that slavery was invented in the 16th century. You know, I mean, it was, and not all the slaves were black. In Greece, they have a slave, and well, some were black, but some were not. So, before 1500, slavery was not related to color. But toward the end of the 16th century, slavery and blackness kind of become almost exchangeable, the same. So there was slavery, but slaves were considered inferior, of course, but they were not dispensable life. And what does it mean that they're dispensable life? That in the 16th century, slavery made of enslaved people a commodity. And what do you do with the commodity? You use it and you throw it away. That is, so from there to Nazis, to Iraq, and I give you more examples. There is a continuation of what are the lives that are worth lived and what are the lives that are kind of dispensable. So the dispensability of human life was originally a kind of economic category, but then became, with the nation state, became a kind of political category, and that is the kind of the concept of bare life or nude life that Hannah Arendt, Agamben, and other people have been working. So that, behind that, is the kind of the logic of coloniality of power. A way of, a structure of management that connects politics, economy, sensibility, being in the world, based on social classification. And that is a kind of the breakthrough of Quijano, who was a Marxist. But the breakthrough is, he said, coloniality is founded in racism. What does it mean? It means, and then he developed the idea of racism without race. So racism is a system of classification, but to have a system of classification, you need knowledge to classify. But it's not enough to have knowledge. You have to control knowledge. You have to have institutions that makes that knowledge and classification valid or legitimate. So to make a long story short, the beginning of the kind of the racial system of classification, or racist system of classification in the 16th century is, on the one hand, the kind of classification between Christian Moors and Jews in Europe, and the classification between Indian, European, Spanish, Indian, and Afro blacks. Right? Black is not a category. Black is an invention, a fiction of that time. So you kind of make uniform everything, because I mean, people enslaved African, as you know, they were coming from different kingdoms, different religions, different languages, different part of Africa, but they become all black. And the same with indigenous people. They were Mapuches, still are, Aymaras, Quechuas, Tocolavales, Nahuatl, etc. They all become Indian. That is the kind of the coloniality based on races. And races, why you make people inferior? Because you cannot dominate and equal. So racism is not a question of the color of your skin, your religion. This is a kind of surface marker. Racism is the possibility of somebody who controls knowledge to make people inferior. And you see it now in Israel, Hamas. You see it in Ukraine. So the rebel Russian and Hamas are kind of dispensable. that we have to get rid of it. So colonialism may be probably ended, but coloniality is all over today. So that's for the first point. I don't want to talk more than so that's for the first point of what do we mean by coloniality. So coloniality, we mean coloniality of power, and if I have more time, I will explain the kind of the colonial nature of power, this kind of the structure of management and domination. But basically the way we analyze it is that there are analyze different domains, kind of economy, politics, gender, sexuality, knowledge, ethnicity, because racialization is kind of classification and hierarchy of ethnicity. So that's a kind of coloniality. And coloniality in some, and when he discovered it, I was telling him what it meant to me when I discovered it, because I discovered coloniality in '96, something like that. And so all of a sudden, kind of, the world changed. And I think that the power of coloniality is the same, is similar to the power of the unconscious in Freud. When Freud introduced the unconscious, wow, that is, the whole thing so began to see and think differently. Because you see something that nobody was seeing. So the same power when Marx introduces surplus value. When you are confronted with surplus value, nobody was seeing it. They were seeing it, the boss kind of employing somebody, getting the salary and say, well, we're all kind of good here. You give me the job, I mean, you give me the labor, I give you the money, and we are. So Marx said, well, there are the surplus value that the boss keep. So I think that the coloniality had the same power. Why? Because what we were seeing was only modernity. And modernity is just half of the story. And modernity, and this is already a decolonial way of thinking. Of course, everything I have been saying is a decolonial way of thinking. It's not the sociological, it's not economic, it's not political, it's not philosophical, it's the decolonial way of thinking. So I lost my track here.
So modernity.
Oh, the modernity. So nobody was telling us that behind modernity, like behind the conscious, behind the boss and the salary, was something else. Nobody was telling us that there was something else, coloniality. So in our analysis now, we are saying that rhetoric is not an ontological historical moment. Modernity is a fiction. It's a narrative fiction in a story told by those who control the sequence of history. Hegel, for example. I mean, Hegel is a monument, it's an epic fiction in which the hero is not Ulysses, it's the spirit. And the spirit is the spirit of the seed of the state, the bourgeois state. That seed was in China and come, got to the present of Germany, which is at the same time the center of Europe, and Europe is already at the time of Hegel the center of the universe. Right? So modernity is a fiction. The other day we're talking about this, but the fact that it's a fiction doesn't mean that it has an ontological value, because that fiction was very effective. So the ontology is not that modernity represents an ontology already existing. It's that modernity is the fiction that created that ontology. So we know these kind of things after Foucault and Derrida, etc. But the question is here how to analyze modernity as a rhetoric, as a fiction, a rhetoric in a sense of persuasion. And modernity is a rhetoric of salvation and promises. Right? Salvation by conversion to Christianity, 16th century there, 17th, 18th century here. Well, 18th century here, the second salvation was not Christianity. It was Christianity, but also civilization, because it was secular. So the missionaries were at the same time kind of competing somehow with the salvation, the secular salvation of France and England. Right? And then was salvation by modernization of development after the 50s. And now we have salvation by market democracy. Okay. So you have to eliminate all those guys who are tyrants to spread democracy, like Iraq. See? So that's it. I mean, I would make a kind of parenthesis here. I mean, I will go short here, but if you think decolonially, you can see from the very beginning that the nation state in Iraq, for example, cannot work. Why cannot work? For several reasons. One is that the nation state and democracy in Europe was a kind of unfolding of European history. And was the nation state. And the nation state was 90% Christian, white. Go to Iraq, go to Bolivia, and how can you have a mono-national state? You cannot. The idea of the nation state was a mono-national state, and nobody thinking, Iraq is not mono-national. I mean, you cannot encapsulate Iraq or Bolivia, in this case, or India. You cannot encapsulate something in a monocultural. So that's interesting, because in Bolivia the concept of plurinational state began to be discussed, at least in the constitution. So modernity is a rhetoric of salvation and promises. But in order to do that, you need to execute the logic of coloniality, which is expropriation, appropriation, racism, genderism, all this kind of thing. So this, I think, was the basic idea, but I go now quickly on the other idea, because we have the element here. So once we have that, when I say we, I refer to the collective group. We introduce the concept of colonial difference. What is a colonial difference? An imperial difference, colonial imperial difference. Very, very important concept for us, and related to what I just said. When we introduced that, we introduced it also in relation with the celebration of cultural difference. That in the United States, but then it was in Europe, and even in Latin America, people were like, cultural difference. We are kind of different, but we live together. Right? And we said, well, we were already thinking decolonially. I said, well, that doesn't work. No, it doesn't work. It cannot work. But it works in the sense I said, yeah, multiculturalism and colonial cultural differences work as far as the control of the state and the economy is in one group that allows you to eat your food, to practice your religion, to dance your dance, but I keep control. Right? And so, well, no, that doesn't work. So what is going on here is the colonial difference. And the colonial difference is related to genderism and racism. It's through the colonial difference that racism came about in the way of it. Why? Because what you do is not a cultural difference with the indigenous or the black or the Chinese. No. You establish a kind of hierarchy. And that hierarchy is imperial colonial. Fanon said it. I mean, Fanon has a fantastic sentence. It says that colonialism is not just happy with kind of destroying your economy and controlling the state. It's the perversity with which it works conceptually and makes you believe that the world is like that. And that is how modernity kind of controls subjectivity. So that is the coloniality of being that Maldonado Torres is elaborating. So we kind of introduce the concept of colonial difference to reinforce what Quijano was saying, that coloniality is founded in racism, and then we develop and genderism. Why genderism? Because, I mean, genderism is a way of classifying sexuality, and racism is a way of classifying ethnicities. Right? So those two pillars of knowledge is a kind of how modernity controls subjectivity and justify political and economic decisions. Right? Because, I mean, to take certain political and economic decisions is not just a question of economic logic or political economy or political theory. Economic and political decisions involve certain subject and certain subjectivity. And this kind of subjectivities have already been trained by the rhetoric of modernity to work with dispensable life. So everything comes, I mean, the state and the economy come first. You have to kind of defend the economy, you have to defend the state, doesn't matter what. You saw it in the crisis of capitalism. I mean, in the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. What were the main discourses in the main media? We have to. Capitalism is not a perfect system, but we don't have another better one. So we have to defend capitalism. 30% of unemployment in Spain, for example, but you have to defend capitalism. $7,000 billion to the bank in the United States. People losing health insurance, education, all that, but you have to save capitalism. And the same with the state. And the state is a very problematic issue because the state has been founded as a kind of national state. And what you do, you defend the nation state. And you kill whoever. So the nation state comes before being human. So that is what the nation state makes life dispensable, politically or economically. Because you have to defend the state, meaning defend the nation. So the kind of the cultural difference, the colonial difference, was a crucial concept for us to begin to analyze, to make sense of this kind of operation of the rhetoric of modernity through the economy, through the state, but also through the sensibilities. Because the state are not machines, are not computers. And the economy are not computers. People, the CEO in the bank, the president, the minister, the Senate, they are people. And there are people who have certain subjectivity and operate according to that, and operate in relation to this kind of. So the colonial difference was introduced in order to make sense in the overall picture of genderism and racism. Say gender is because, I mean, to get quickly what I'm what I'm referring to. In the 16th century in Africa, let's say in South America, there were no women. See that? How come? How can no women? Are you crazy? What are you saying? Women is an imperial concept to classify sexuality, right? So of course that in the Andes, I mean, life, the regeneration of life needs two types of bodies and two types of function of those bodies. So that's a kind of everybody, you know, animals and plants, the regeneration. But the fact that there are two bodies that are needed for the regeneration of life, let's say human, doesn't mean that one is woman, that's men. There are two different things. Men and women are fictions, are invention of modernity, right? So that's what we call genderism. Genderism is a fiction that classifies sexuality, but at the same time put a norm, heteronormativity, and eliminate, degrade all other kind of. So colonial difference serve us to kind of explain in a different way how racism and genderism operate as fiction of modernity. right? But also we introduced the concept of imperial difference. So colonial difference was articulated first because, I mean, what we are working here is this colonial major power emerged in the 16th century, but then continued, transformed, changed hands. From Spain, go to the Dutch to the British to the French and the British. And we follow the transformation and the change of hands, but I mean, I'm referring to the big stroke, to the logic, to the basic logic. So we needed the imperial difference. Why? Because we needed to explain China. What do you mean? China, but we needed to explain Russia. And we need to explain the BRIC now. But that was in the 90s, there was no BRICS. The colonial difference was articulated on the basis of the indigenous and the Africans in the 16th century. People without religion. The imperial difference. And the Jews. I mean, the Jews became the kind of the internal colonial of Europe since the 16th century, when they were expelled from Spain, and Christianity became the kind of the dominant, not just institution, but the dominant system of knowledge and the dominant control of subjectivities. Right? But the Spanish never could colonize, destroy the Ottoman Sultanate. But they managed to make the Ottoman Sultanate inferior because they were Muslim Turks. So that is how the imperial difference works. So China was never colonized, but they began to make them inferior as yellow. That began in the 18th century. And in the mid-19th century, England with the United States and France did the Opium War, kind of shocked India, right, and began to control it, and India kind of recovered after 150 years. And we see now how the imperial difference works. I can't say more about that, but I mean the question of the BRICS and the question of China and Russia, what Russia is doing now in Ukraine, and what China is doing also supporting Russia, and Russia doing, is because it's the first time in the history of modern colonial war, the coloniality, the first time that capital, not capital, but capital and knowledge began to be controlled by people of color. 500 years, capital and knowledge was controlled by white people. White Spanish, white Portuguese, white French, white English, white Dutch, white United States. But the Russians are white. Well, yeah, I'm white in the skin, but as I said before, I mean, the kind of one thing is the skin and the other thing is racialization. So the Russians are people of color in the sense that are Orthodox, that they have Cyrillic alphabet, they are Slavs. And Chinese are yellow. So what we see now, the tension now, and you see in Ukraine, for example, but you see in many other parts, is the tension between the shock of the imperial differences and how kind of socioeconomic civilization that have not been dismantled, like the Incas and Aztecs, are kind of rebuilding themselves. And you would see now, I think, in Turkey, Erdogan was already, and the Chinese too. The Chinese and Erdogan were talking about, we are not nation state. What do we have to do with nation state? That's the kind of European thing. We're a civilizational state. So that's why Erdogan had been talking about for a long time to rebuild Turkey as the civilization state, going back to the Ottoman with Ataturk. What Erdogan did, the first thing after he was elected, go to the mosque. So this is the kind of how the response, so the kind of the Western imperialism, let's put it this way. Western domination is ending. Not Western civilization, and that's not necessarily to end. I mean, I think Western civilization was a big contribution to the humankind, like the Egyptian, like the Chinese, like the Islam, the Ottoman, Persia, Kingdom of Africa, Aztec, Inca, all kind of contribute. And so modernity is the youngest civilization and the first that encroach over the world. So Western civilization made a great contribution, but kind of a step into an aberration. And the big aberration is to try to make the world like the West. So that's kind of the imperial difference allow us to kind of explain what is going on today, not only because of politics. Not forget that these people have dignity, and that dignity has been crushed by the West many, many times. So the imperial difference allow us to kind of analyze kind of the conflict in the global order in a different way. Not only in the sense of historically, but also in relation to the sensibilities behind it. So you can criticize Putin for a lot of things, but the fact that you criticize Putin for a lot of things should not prevent you to understand why he's doing what he's doing, because he doesn't want to be. Okay? You see, the Opium War was a great humiliation from the West to the Chinese. The Chinese don't forget that. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a tremendous humiliation. You don't forget that. The Financial Times, long time ago, I mean, not time ago, 10 years ago, had an article about a book talking about China, and there was a kind of, it was a cartoon, and the cartoon was kind of Confucius walking with Linnaeus, a big book of Linnaeus. You know why Linnaeus? Because Linnaeus translated the theological Christian classification of people into the secular, and then Kant used that to kind of. So Confucius is working, and a CEO with the kind of tie and a maletin, kind of walking toward Confucius, the kind of extending the hand, and Confucius nothing, kind of doesn't move the hand. So and the caption says, "Those who classify always forget. Those who are classified never forget." That is the colonial and the imperial difference, and the kind of what we call the colonial and imperial wound. And you have to understand. I mean, Marxists don't understand that because Marxists are kind of operating on the kind of abstract ideas of political economy, right? So, but then once you understand the imperial and colonial difference, you understand border thinking. You understand border gnosis. You understand border dwelling in the border and thinking in the border. Because border thinking is not a question of philosophical logic. It's not a question of analytic philosophy. It's an existential question. When you dwell in the border and you realize that you dwell in the border, and when you dwell in the border, you dwell in the colonial or imperial difference. And when you realize that, you begin to think and act and perceive things in a different way. So you see, that is a kind of starting from the concept of coloniality, all the kind of the derivation that the kind of the coloniality is. And when you start kind of border thinking, you begin to delink. Delink from what? From modernity coloniality. From the discourse, because there is discourse, that tells you what the world is, what it should be, what the world I want, and I want you to be. And you say, no, thank you, but no. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I will negotiate that, but I won't follow that. So you can do that personally, in community, a group, but you can do it also as a state. If China doesn't, the Chinese, when I say China, I mean the government, the government of China, the bureau. If China or the Chinese bureau did not engage in border thinking, they will not be where they are now. And engaging in border thinking allow them to disobey the IMF and the World Bank. In the 70s, when Africa was still perhaps some struggle for decolonization, some states were recently decolonized, 10 years or something like that, Latin America was supposed to develop. I mean, the 50s and the 70s was supposed to develop. Kind of the rhetoric of modernity at the time was modernization and development. It didn't. It was a dictatorship, crisis of all kinds. Why? Because the elite of Latin America did obey the IMF and the World Bank. So at the same time, Singapore and China were kind of disobeying, and they kind of taking it there. So the question is that is kind of acting at the level of the imperial difference. How do you act at the level of the colonial difference? Well, that is where we are not, decoloniality in that sense is not working at the level of the state or the level of corporation, but the level of the political society. And the political society is that emerging society that began to realize that the state and the corporation are not working for the people. So we have to work on ourselves. So the kind of decolonial thinking now allow us to think the future in a different way. We can still complain and act and do our thing as citizens in relation to the state, but you cannot hope that the state and the corporation will kind of solve the problems or act for the people. Forget it. And that is in South Africa, that's in Argentina, that is in the United States, that's in China. So the state and the corporation are kind of a different world. If we get benefit, they're kind of a beneficial casualty. So that's the kind of analysis that on the one, I mean, because the coloniality is an analytic category, but then that we analyze decolonially. But at the same time, decoloniality should be a perspective. So once we realize that, toward where we move. So the last point I want to make here is global coloniality. And I think I said everything already that will make this point very easy to articulate. Global coloniality was there from day one. There is a book by Carl Schmitt, The Nomos of the Earth. You know, Carl Schmitt is known in South Africa, yeah? So The Nomos of the Earth is it's a wonderful book. It's a very honest book. It's half of the story, but at the same time, it's a kind of honest Catholic German. That's important because as a Catholic, he had been in Spain and many times and have a connection in Spain, and he knows Spanish thinker of the 16th century, the theologian of the 16th century. So in that book, the thesis is, he introduced the wonderful concept of global linear thinking. And global linear thinking, he said, is Eurocentered. And he said Eurocentered not as a critique, he said Eurocentered. Why? Because global linear thinking mapped the planet according to the interests of Europe. So that's global coloniality. I mean, when you start, as I said at the beginning, when you have massive appropriation of land, massive exploitation of labor, surplus commodities for the global market, and you have Europe mapping the world and inventing international law to justify That's what Grotius did. I mean, first Vitoria in Spain, but then Grotius was the ideologue of the Dutch to kind of justify etc., etc. So, global coloniality is there from the beginning. What has changed? I mean, global coloniality is coloniality of power, if the colonial makes of power. That's all kinds of different expressions, because Europe kind of extended, and then when the United States took over, but the same logic. What is changing now, and that is the big moment we are, I mean, all over the world we are living, is that the West, and when I say the West, I say the Imperial West, Iberian Peninsula, France, Dutch, England, United States. The West control global coloniality. The West cannot longer today control global coloniality. Right. Global coloniality continued, but the question is who controls it? Who called the shot? You want to invade Syria and take Assad away? Wait a minute. That is not convenient for us. So Assad stayed. So you want to organize Crimea, I mean Ukraine, in order to incorporate in the NATO, so you have another extension of Europe, and no, I take Crimea. So that Iraq, with all the consequences we are seeing today, I think is the last gesture of the West controlling global coloniality. Perhaps Libya, we kind of Cameroon and Sarkozy. But no longer. Look at what's happened again. I mean, Syria, they were stopped. There are other moments in which China and India stopped the 7 Doha round. They stopped 2 rounds of the world trade that we didn't know much, that this is more visible. But then we have Syria, then we have Ukraine. This is the first time that Netanyahu managed to generate a global dissenting with Israel. So, Japan and Israel are the kind of the post of the United States, one to control the East and one to control the Middle East. And so Netanyahu was doing more or less well, in the sense that, but now I think and I think that this kind of increase of tension and destruction and war is because the West cannot longer control global coloniality. And because of that, the most dangerous states for global peace now are not North Korea, and not Iran. The most dangerous is the European Union, I mean not the European Union, Germany, England, France, with the support of the other states, and United States. Why? Because it's very hard to lose privilege. And that is what we are seeing today, that the global coloniality is not longer controlled. You cannot, this morning, and I finished with that, but it was absolutely raining. When you think decolonially, you cannot understand this kind of thing. I was telling you, I mean, I don't know if they are perverse, they are ignorant, or they are totally denial. The commissaire of the European Union was angry because Argentina and many Latin American countries are taking advantages of sanctions to Russia to negotiate with Russia. So, right, I mean, Europe cannot send tomatoes anymore. All the tomatoes come from Argentina. And he was angry because they said these countries are not loyal to us anymore. If you are an Argentinian, Argentinian, you say, what? And then he gives an example. Instead, he said, Canada, Australia, and Norwegian, they took the sanction as their own. So when you analyze that in relation to colonial difference at the level of the state, you understand. I mean, who are Canada? They are on the family of kind of the rewesternization. And now Latin America, except Colombia, except Peru, and except Mexico, they are all with the BRICS. They are all moving toward what we call de-Westernization. De-Westernization is the dispute for the control of the colonial mixture of power of the BRICS, and you are involved in that. But also now with Turkey, and that will increase because of the new election of Erdogan, will increase with the new Prime Minister of Indonesia, who is a kind of a pro-China guy, and Nigeria, I think that is going into that kind of direction. Well, what is decoloniality? Decoloniality is an analytic of coloniality, but it's also a way of being in the world. A way of being in the world by knowing how we have been classified the place that we occupy in the colonial mixture of power in relation to that kind of classification and hierarchy that is racism and genderism. So
we're looking at China, looking at Russia and India, but do we look at what happens within these countries that are becoming these powers? What happens as far as human rights in China, the right to information? What happens around gay rights in Russia and expression of freedom? What's happening in India now that we have a new Prime Minister who's going to make India an economic power? But then what about what's happening within these countries?
Carolyn and
my name is Carolyn, and a lot of the work I do is interested in the particular way in which a concept of archive, the particular concept of archive operates in the present. While you were speaking, I performed a thought experiment for myself, for my own current work, which is, as you described what coloniality is, I tried to think about examples of pre-colonial and pre-capitalist large imperial formations and the kinds of colonialism that they've had. And I was thinking particularly of Southern African examples. And I thought to myself, right, there isn't the same sort of massive alienation of land, but there is massive extraction of labor. There is definitely, you know, we can show this huge hierarchization in the classification of people, without question. So that's ethnicities classified, some people at the bottom of the pile, other people, the super exploited at the bottom of the pile, the more advantaged at the top of the pile with a kind of ethnic, and sometimes all kinds of identity stuff working. And the further I went with the thought experiment, as you unfolded each step of your argument, is I began to think about the way in which the control of the knowledge that underpinned the classification process and where that was located, which comes back to my original notion of archive. And I thought that one of the big differences in the states that I was performing the thought experiment was that people's understanding of their own subjectivity, located in ideas of ancestors, demanded that they keep control of it. So you don't have a centralized church or a centralized religion that can be overtaken and become the locus of the notion of subjectivity that's in place. So people have to defend their identity and their subjectivity because of their dependence on ancestors, which led me then to think that a key point would be both the non-appropriation of land, without that massive appropriation of land. Of course, there's a huge difference of scale. I accept that. I mean, and that's the point that you started out with. But then I wondered very much about this, what happens to subjectivities when something countervails on the centralization of control of knowledge and subjectivity. Sorry, a long
No, but that's the point.
Comment.
Make argument. I mean, not argument, but we can explain the position.
Do you want to take those three? or you're happy to take
Yeah,
it?
let's take these three, okay. So the main thrust of your question was why I am bringing this kind of relationship between China and Russia. So what is the key?
The key thing is basically, I was just taking this, where does the Soviet Union fit into the sort of, and the Soviet bloc fit into the sort of system of classification in terms of empires?
So the Soviet Union from 1819 to 1889?
Yeah.
Ah, okay, thank you. Yeah. So I was thinking also, I think at some point you said why this addressing these issues. So I will say it anyway. I think thinking decolonially for us is kind of thinking the world order, the formation and the transformation of the world, at the same time thinking subjectivity, kind of interaction, bringing so because who is doing the analysis of the world order today? You got to be political scientist, you got to be in New York, you got to be Marxist also, kind of. So no, there is another way of looking at it, so we bring it to that. So that's very interesting. The second point is very interesting. How the Soviet Union fit into that. That's a very interesting question, and we have been working on that. And what is interesting there, and because a lot of people say today, we are again in the Cold War. No, we are not in the Cold War. The Cold War was liberal capitalism against state capitalism. But the two kind of coming from the Enlightenment. Liberal capitalism won. And the invisible hand and all of that. You cannot, I think, about liberal capitalism did is to work with the desire of the people, and you cannot work with the obligation, so the state. But what we are, so in that sense, the difference that we see between the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation is that it's not longer, it's a kind of, it's capitalism against capitalism. But again, it's capitalism against capitalism of people of color. And people of color who have been humiliated. So that is what we call de-Westernization. The Soviet Union was not de-Westernization. The Soviet Union was a fight within the West between socialist, communist, and liberal capitalists. Now we are in a different kind of ballgame. And that's why we introduced de-Westernization, to understand the Russian Federation in relation to the Soviet Union, and understand the BRICS, understand Indonesia, etc., etc. So that direction is. The second question is, yes, we do. But that is, I mean, we do. But this is a continuation of the work that was done in the 80s, 90s, the kind of. Chatterjee kind of writing about the nation and all that. Everybody was talking about the nation and the nation state in the 80s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, everybody started talking about globalization. So what we are looking at is at the interstate relation. But we have to talk about inner state relation. Well, I mean, this, as I said before, I mean, in India or in Bolivia, I think that the big change in Bolivia, for example, now, and the big change, I think, in South Africa, and you correct me if I am wrong, but I'm kind of looking at this in parallel, is that now you have a black middle class and an elite middle class in the government. And that, on the one hand, is great. What is new in Bolivia is that you have a indigenous elite bourgeoisie, a high middle class, and you have Indians in elite in the government, and that is good. But much remain the same in relation to the configuration of the nation. So yeah, I think that the fact that China is becoming the first economy in the world, and India probably the third in 10 years, that doesn't mean that everybody in India and everybody in China will benefit from that. So that is precisely what coloniality does. So what happened now, the dispute for the control of coloniality doesn't mean that the nation state will improve. And that is why the nation state or the civilization state is in question. I think that we cannot expect that this kind of, that's why decoloniality is necessary. Because decoloniality, on the one hand, offers you the analytic, but the perspective is not to have a decolonial state, because the state cannot be decolonial. Decoloniality cannot function, cannot work at the level of the state. Decoloniality has to work at the level of the political society. We have guys to organize a different way of life. And we, of course, we cannot go to the mountain. We have to have one foot here and one foot there. But to have a vision of a society that is beyond the nation state, which is a kind of, so the archive, that is a very interesting reflection. We don't talk about pre. There is no pre-capital and there is no pre-colonial. They are non-modern. Because if you said pre, you fall into the unilinear teleology of history. And once modernity came, everything is pre. No. All other form, I mean, there is a lot of continuity, kind of coexistence. In China, in Latin America, in Africa, there is no pre. There are different form of life that coexist. So we never talk about pre, and we talk never about post, because pre and post, you are trapped into a kind of way of thinking time that has been handed to you. So, but the question is, what happened to the non-capitalist or non-colonial before colonialism or during colonialism? Right? So that's why, I mean, a parenthesis. Decoloniality is not post-colonial. We don't need the independence to start thinking decoloniality. Decoloniality goes together with coloniality in the 16th century. You can find already. When you read Achebe, Not Longer at Ease, that is not post-colonial. It's the same year that Nigeria was getting independence. And things fall apart. This is not post-colonial, right? But it's now being analyzed as post-colonial. So thinking decolonially doesn't need independence or the post-colonial. Well, this is a part. The question of classification, yes. The Greeks said the barbarian, the Aztecs said there are chichimecas. Chichimecas were those who didn't talk perfect Nahuatl, and the barbarian, the who didn't talk perfect Greek. China have a kind of nested rectangles to kind of classify people. None of these classifications were racist in the modern sense, because racist in the modern sense is related to capital and labor. So since those societies were not capitalist and didn't need exploitation of labor to accumulate in the sense of capitalism, classification existed, but were not racist in the sense that racism was articulated in the 16th century. So there were a lot of things that existed before 1500, but have been resemanticized, give a new meaning. So the question of classification is not necessarily new, the 1600, it's the way people have been classified and what for. So that is why racism is, Quijano said, coloniality is founded on racism because racism was needed in order to make people inferior, to colonize them, and at that moment was in the Americas kind of related to the exploitation of labor. So, but your question is also very interesting in the sense that it's from there that we kind of start thinking about border thinking. Because those pre never disappear and they are not in the past. The archives are here. Somebody was asking me yesterday, but how can you, I mean, how you talk about indigenous thought, and because, I mean, there are records. Well, there are memories. There are records, but there are memory, and there are today indigenous people, indigenous intellectual living. But those indigenous people have been always articulated, let's say in Bolivia and Ecuador, as pre-modern, pre-state. No, they are not pre-state. They always coexisted with the state. But in a way, I think that the bottom line here, after all these comments, is that for us, in this kind of theory, history starts in the 16th century. Right? Because when you said that history started, I don't know where, the Greeks, the Big Bang, the Bible, the Popol Vuh, there are all kind of beginning of history, but we are kind of privileging one way of history, that is the modern way of looking back. Until the 18th century, barbarians, well, that was the classification, were all in space. In the 18th century, the concept of the primitive was invented. And the concept of a primitive shrank the space and put the space all in the same line. And now we cannot get out of that kind of path of the primitive, that is kind of nebulous, but this is one of the kind of the blindest part of modernity. I tell you one specific example. Carl Schmitt, that I like that book, he talks about the first and the second nomos of the earth. He said, before 1500, there were many nomos. You know, nomos is a kind of metaphorical concept of law, meaning that people living in a territory have some kind of law, some kind of conceptualization of that territory to manage that territory, right? So that's a nomos. Today we talk about territoriality. So Schmitt said, before 1500, there were many nomos. And that was the first nomos of them. Then came the second nomos. And the second nomos is global linear thinking. And all the other nomos became one. And all kind of receded to the past. And all kind of come in a linear. No, they were not. So this kind of archives, non-modern archives, are precisely the archives that are being activated in de-Westernization and decoloniality. I wrote an article, I mean, stop here, but I wrote an article, a kind of short kind of op-ed, enacting the archive about the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha and the Museum of Asian Civilization in Singapore. And the point was that the memories of these cultures, you have to go to the British Museum or the Ethnographic Museum of Berlin or the Louvre. And they said, no. Now we take the four museum and we build, if you want to know our memories and come here. So you see, that those are the kind of the archive that are being reinscribed into the form of domination, economic, political, subjectivity, art, etc., etc. So I don't know if I address your complex question, but the question is, how do we think the past?
No, I think I misplaced my question. So I don't know whether to reformulate it or let it go on. I'll leave it to you.
From the chair, I wanted to say, I thought the point that you were making about control of systems of knowledge and formation of subjectivities and the role of the ancestors is very, very interesting. And I certainly want to engage you around that from the perspective of a decolonial archaeology on future occasions. I mean, and I think you're exactly right to connect it to notions of archive. I haven't done that previously, and I find that very interesting. So let's continue the conversation.
Okay. So I'm going to now adopt, because I'm prepared to adopt entirely your terminology of saying don't talk pre. I buy that. I think that's exactly right. So the argument you're putting forward. If I am then starting to work very seriously on the nature of history in your terms before 1500, because that's what I'm interested in. And I'm imagining, well, how do I do this? And yes, there are multitudes of what you've called non-modern archives that present extraordinary challenges in how to find them, how to activate them, how to utilize them, how to, you know, they're very, this is a very complex challenge, a beautiful, exciting challenge. In working in that area, I find that one of the places that I want to go to work in, is when I get into very deep family histories, where people are talking not about something that they call or respond to as history, they're thinking about ancestors. And the proposition that I was putting forward is that there are all sorts of things that in that setting, they are concerned closely to guard and to protect and preserve, and have done so across time in all sorts of different ways, in changing ways. I'm not imagining these things exist unchanged, unaffected by the many things that happen to them, but nonetheless, that there's an immense effort that's gone into holding that in place. And that I imagine, because I have to just imagine this, happened again in the terms that you're talking about, pre-1500, right?
Yeah.
If that was happening then I'm thinking to myself, and my question's a slightly different one to yours, what was the nature, not of coloniality, but of the colonialisms that might have existed pre-1500? And once I'm asking that question, I think to myself, so was there a form then of coloniality then? And is it specific to this colonialism? And that's the question I was trying to ask you. Because some of the factors you talked about, I can tick those same boxes in your terms again, pre-1500. But some of the factors I can't. Some of the factors look specific to the post-1500 examples of colonialism. That was my question. So you're talking about a coloniality of a now, a post-1500 coloniality. I asked the question, so in these earlier colonialisms, would there have been a form of coloniality, or is it specific to this time? And I'm sorry I didn't explain my question adequately to start with.
But this is why the conversation I will address it, now it's becoming clear, but this is coloniality we talk about from the 1600 on. There's no coloniality, maybe colonialism in the Roman Empire, but there's no coloniality. So that's one thing. So the word form of domination in the Incanate or the Tlatoanate, but number one, we are talking about colonialism, modern colonial world order, and coloniality. We don't talk about coloniality before 1600. Coloniality is a specific of this world. And second is related to the kind of the colonial. When we look at the past, or look at somebody looking at the past, it's not so much, we don't pay much attention to the fact of historical, but what pay attention to is how the past is taken up to intervene in the present. So how the uses of the past become political, in the sense that the discourse of modernity have disavowed, made that past irrelevant or less relevant, etc. So we are not historian in that sense, the discipline of historian. We look at the past, but we look at the past politically. And who is, for example, how indigenous people now are kind of reinvesting the memories, the ancestral memories that have been devalued, disavowed, into the political present. Because the political present, even in Bolivia, is Greco-Roman European. So that's the kind of difference with the discipline.
Thank you. I want to go to some of the other questions if you might. David, thanks for waiting.
In a way, my question is the same as Carolyn's, except I was doing a mental experiment about the after 1970s capitalism, which I call a third capitalist industrial revolution, and whether you can just use all these concepts, which she was worrying about pre-1500, whether it's so simple to use it post-1970s. And I mean, to just introduce myself, I mean, I'm a sociologist. I'm also a Marxist, which you commented about. So I'm coming at it at that angle. I'm interested in your concept. I'm a novice. I'm I'm interested partly because I'm director of this group at this school where I've been proposing the concept decolonialism. And I wanted to see whether your coloniality I could change to decolon or just coloniality. And what I take from what you're saying is some very valuable concepts which I think Marxism hasn't looked at enough. Issues of subjectivity, meaning, the concept, ideas of meaning for the colonial or the colonized. I even like your idea of imperial and colonial differences. All of that I can buy. What I get really worried about is when, because I see that as all valuable contributions to the symbolic, to ideas, power and knowledge, great. But then a guy asked, who comes from a literature background says, explain to me pre-1989 Russia. And I'm just not convinced the concepts that have been thrown about, while valuable, we're now talking social science. We're not talking symbol, power, knowledge, even difference. We are asking a global social science question. And you answer state capitalism. And I'm not sure if you know, there's a massive debate of whether you can see Russia as state capitalist before 1989. It depends on your concept of capitalism, and you've just assumed that we all agree what capitalism is. You spoke about China as now non-white people holding capital. I mean, whether one can see capital what do you mean by capital in China is not a simple question. Your discussion of the importance of land during the 1600s and 1700s, absolutely correct. Land was fundamental to the first phase of capitalism. Land is actually not very important to post-1970s capitalism. You mentioned but we can debate that, but I don't think land is fundamental to the new capitalism. The same, you argue that, I think middle capitalism, which I would say after the first industrial revolution, that commodification of labor is absolutely central. In actual fact, what I think the new capitalism is about is commodification of the unemployed and the precariat and that. It doesn't worry, they are not commodities anymore. They're just dumping grounds for non-commodity people. So what I'm saying is, if you're going to ask these questions of the nature of China today and Iran, and she asked the question of China, I'm not convinced at all that we can talk social science in this way with just your limited concepts. They're just not nuanced enough. And you need a much more sharp political economy before you start talking about symbols and the differences and that. You're making, I think, causal explanations which for me just don't work.
All right, thank you.
We are not talking, but this, I think that this is important kind of clarification. I am not talking social science. Social science for me is an object of analysis, not the way of thinking.
What was your answer then, in terms of field of studying? How did you answer it? You didn't mainly speak about power and knowledge and symbolism. You did a political economy analysis of China, of Russia before 1984, 1989. By my term, you were doing a political economy answer to it.
But what is your question?
To his question, he said the
question of the Soviet Union?
Or political, cultural, economic, a general and social science analysis you had to do to answer that question. And you answered it in terms of culture and difference and power and knowledge. I question that. And state capitalism.
Okay, thanks for questioning that. I mean,
but you want to make it in debate here, right?
Yes, I wanted to make a contribution here. I think one of the great dangers of disciplinary boundaries and disciplinization, especially in discussions like this, is that people tend to think that there is a domain that is political economy that is different from a domain which is symbol and culture and so on. And this is a massive mystification of modernity itself. That, you see, if the issue is a question of an episteme and a system that generates a particular kind of knowledge, and this kind of knowledge can branch out into political economy, sociology, or whatever. But I think we should try to move away from a certain kind of thinking. I mean, I say this because this is what I was just doing in class today. That part of modernity is creating a world of the unconscious, of art, of symbol, and this world is different from the political economy world where you deal with the hard economic facts. And at the moment we begin to think in this way, we are being captured basically by a modernist way of thinking that sees these divisions. And I think that what we should do is be more, I think to use your own term, border thinking in this sense, because if we completely disarticulate the political economy from all of these issues that we're talking about, then we would have fallen into the same trap of, you know, thinking through these greeds that we have inherited. And I'm not sure that they are particularly helpful in some of these situations.
Thank you. That's a comment. I'm going to take one or two more comments on this point, and then I encourage you to think of some different other questions too.
Yeah, I have one question, but I would like to engage into this debate because it's pretty much what I was thinking about. I'm from Brazil, Marcelo. I teach sociology at the University of Brasilia, and I think I would like to. I think my view are quite the same of Harry's view on what the problem are the social sciences, and I think Professor Mignolo has responded in different ways in some of his articles, if I understood it well. So the problem is that the social sciences have, in a kind of methodological and theoretical ways, they have shaped a world that is completely stabilized and it's already constructed. So we know, we almost know everything about what we do research on. So let me give you an example. I do research on landless movements. For many years I've been comparing the Brazilian and the South African landless movements. And a lot of people, they try to use the colonial theories to explain, like for example, the Brazilian landless movement. What they don't get is that the way the Brazilian landless movement is conceived is a completely modern movement in a way the Brazilian landless movement does not include indigenous Brazilians. Brazilians indigenous movements are regarded as indigenous movements, and the land for the landless are not the same land, is not the same land that the land for the indigenous. So there's this kind of border thinking, and there's this confusions. And my problem with the social sciences, and I do teach sociology, and I use Professor Mignolo's papers in my courses, and one of the problems is that when one of our students, they try to combine the traditional sociological subjects with the coloniality, what we have is a kind of schizophrenical work, where we have a kind of rhetorical work for 50 pages saying the coloniality, border, and so on, and then you come with political economy. and at the end you get nothing, because you keep like splitting things, because we are not able to get rid of our traditions, our disciplinary traditions like sociology, history, archaeology, and all others. So this is just a comment, but I think it's my question is, what should be an interesting research agenda for the coloniality nowadays?
We'll wait for that.
Sandy.
Yes, it's an entirely new point. My name is Sandy Young. I teach in the English department, and I have been working on a manuscript which is now under review. So I've just finished this big project whose title at the moment is Inscribing a Global South in Print. Human difference and the production of knowledge in early modernity, and my period is the 16th century, so from 1500 to 1600, and I'm studying the texts which set up precisely the kinds of hierarchical structures, the differentiation between the peoples of the world that historians tell me I should not talk about as a process of racialization, but I do insist on using that word because it's a kind of a racialized imaginary that gets set up through these processes of, through the formalized production of text. So I look at maps and the reproduction of images of the people of what the texts themselves call the South. So my most recent chapters started sort of making this concept quite compelling, because I see equivalences being set up in these regions of disempowerment, where, through discourses of new world discourses, but in fact, and images get used across regions like India, or the Moluccas and Ethiopia and southern parts of Africa and the so-called New World, cannibalistic images. So my interest is in how these get marshaled and create a sense of a kind of a global hierarchy of peoples. And in precise, I mean, your talk was fascinating for me because it relates so closely to what I'm doing, and I need to think about the usefulness of your term coloniality and decoloniality to. So my question has to do with a sort of a slightly different area of my work. I teach a course on Shakespeare in the Global South, and I was just yesterday, we were reading a sort of a rewriting of The Tempest that emerged out of a Mauritian playwright. And Françoise Lyonnais writes about this play, Tufan, and she uses the term trans-coloniality. Trans-coloniality. And so I wanted to ask, I suppose what was interesting about the way in which she was deploying that term is that she was seeing the way in which this Mauritian playwright was was not rewriting speaking back to Shakespeare the Great, but finding moments of sympathy in the Tempest, very much from within the context of Mauritius. And she spoke about the need to be able to find a language to write ourselves differently, or write ourselves otherwise, from within the Global South. And so my question has to do with the usefulness of these terms when we sit on the other side. So, I mean, obviously the concept of coloniality is useful in order to be able to identify and analyze away the sort of structures of power. But is it useful to be able to think about equivalences not equivalences that are imposed on the people of the Global South, but to look for moments of sort of sympathetic but complex, nuanced connections in order to find new terms, to be able to write ourselves otherwise, that do not take direction from the North.
Because I think it makes easier for me now to address your point. I am not talking social sciences. I use the term capitalism and the state's capitalism because, it would be longer to talk about economic and political coloniality, which is, that's why I say we don't talk about capitalism. Capitalism is a Western concept that the liberals like Weber and the Marxists like Lenin don't. They agree that there is something capitalist. We talk about economic coloniality and economic political colonial authority. What we do is to trace the kind of the movement of the different domain through history and the interrelation, the flows. Give you an example. Not of the 70s, we can take it the 70s, but I think that we can take the 18th century, because then the rearticulation of coloniality at all the level is secularism, right? Then you have the physiocrat, and you have Adam Smith, who goes against the mercantilist or the mercantilized system. But at the same time that the economy is being rearticulated, the nation-state emerged, because emerged a new ethno-class we call the bourgeoisie today, that needs people like like Smith to justify this kind of economy, that kind of a state, to knock down the church and to knock down. At the same time, world religion appears. So at the moment in which secularists takes theology, marginalized theology, invent world religion, keep Christianity because Christianity is a buffer against Islam, and at the same time the concept of aesthetic emerges. So this is the kind of analysis we do. So if we go to the 90s, well, okay, we can start talking about the moment in which technological capital accumulation and financialization. And why financialization started in the 70s? What happened in the 70s? A lot of things happened that allows the corporation to get more money. I mean, there are flows in migrants, women began to work, wages stay fixed, gains goes up, corporation become banks, lend money. So that is the kind of analysis we do. We are not sociologists, we are not philosophers, we just anti-colonial thinkers. So we have dialogue with the discipline, but we kind of disobedient in relation to the discipline, because in a way that kind of and I think that your concept of border thinking goes there, because we are not interdisciplinary, we're undisciplinary. And that is why I wrote this article, Epistemic Disobedience. And I kind of make argument. So this is the way we are articulating, and I said this is not the Bible, this is the way we are in the world. And then we can talk with you, with philosopher, with historian, and they say, well, this is our position. Let's kind of work together. So I think this is a very, what do the colonial want? But I think this, I mean, in relation to your question too, I think it's important to introduce the concept of shifting the geography of reasoning. This is a concept introduced by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. They are philosophers, but we are working together. So they are philosophers from the Caribbean, they are black philosophers. What kind of philosophers are those? I mean, that's what I say, capital and knowledge are escaping the white, right? So shifting the geography of reasoning, it means that we don't study anymore. We don't have a kind of, this is my field of study. No, we just think. So what do we think? We think constantly and analyze constantly how the colonial matrix of power works, become transformed, being used. I mean, we can say how the discourse of Obama or Putin or Xi Jinping are kind of what, for example, what happened in art, what happened in. So shifting the geography of reason, and I think that your example of the schizophrenia is clear, because you have a modern subjectivity in relation to research, and if you have a topic of research, etc., and you apply. No, you don't apply. So shifting the geography of reasoning means that you don't think like that anymore. We don't think like the social scientists who have an empirical object. Let me put it this way. Horkheimer in 37 made this distinction between traditional theory and critical theory. By traditional theory, he didn't mean as a value judgment. Traditional theory, he meant empirical theory. Kind of empiricism, that you have an object of study, you have a method, you just go and analyze and bring more data. And he said, traditional theory distinguishes between the known object and the knowing subject. Critical theory, that doesn't exist anymore because it is the subject that creates. So our only object of study is coloniality. And the goal, why do we study that? Because we want to delink from that. We don't just want to know, to tell you this is how it works, or just to kind of increment the degree of truthfulness. No, this is a political investigation from the very moment. What do we want to know is how coloniality is oppressing us and many people. So we want to understand how the system works in order to delink from the system. So that is the only, and that's a kind of the shift in the geography of reason. If you don't do that, and you want to apply coloniality, you become schizophrenic, I think, very clear. I know many examples in Latin America of that. So your question now is related to that. I cannot answer with the Tempest, I will answer with Othello. I have a friend who is an artist, a performer, or he's a storyteller. There is no, kind of storytelling we were talking this morning about. Patrice Nayambana. Patrice Nayambana is from Sierra Leone. His father was involved in the struggle of decolonization, very good friend of Nkrumah, all this kind of thing. And he went to London, Patrice, and he became, he's a phenomenal actor. He became an actor in England. So kind of, and then he said, was saying about the discipline. He said, no, that is not the theater I want to do. Right? And so he invented in 1992 something like, it's called Tribal Soul. And you can find it in the web. Tribal Soul, Patrice Nayambana. And one of the things he does is, he said one day, why Laurence Olivier has to be painted black to represent Othello. So what he did, he took Othello to Zimbabwe and Namibia, working with people of Namibia and Zimbabwe, not actors, people, and making sense of Othello, but making sense of Othello with working with the people in the, representing, enacting Othello. So I think that this is one of the ways, not to study Shakespeare, but we cannot avoid the West. There is no reason to ignore. We cannot ignore. We have to know it.
Oh, song of